Warning. This podcast contains discussions of violence and sex. Listener discretion is advised.
There were 3 ravens sat on a tree. Down a down, hey, down a down. They were as black as they might be with a down. One of them said to his mate, "Where shall we our breakfast take? With a down, derry, 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 down, down."
Welcome back to Something Wicked, a bonus series from the Three Ravens podcast all about historical monsters, maniacs and murderers from across the world of folklore. I'm Martin.
And I'm Eleanor.
And today we're talking about La Monvoisin, one of the most infamous mass murderers in all of history, a woman who made her way from poverty on the streets of Paris right to the heart of the royal court, and who was also famed as a witch, a midwife, and a very successful fortune teller.
What a life!
Yeah, a wild and crazy life. And of course, along the way, we'll be answering big, important questions, like, which specific insects did people believe you needed to mash up to make love potion? How did black masses work in Paris during the mid-17th century? And which strategies might you consider if you're seeking to poison a member of the French aristocracy?
Just to be clear, Martin is being facetious here. We're not recommending that you kill French aristocrats.
Most definitely not, especially because many of the strategies we'll be talking about didn't work. But some of them did.
Well, this is going to be fun. And before we start, we should also make a plea for everyone to vote for Three Ravens in the Listener's Choice category of the British Podcast Awards.
Yeah, voting is open now. And if you've never voted before, it's very easy. Just visit britishpodcastawards.com/voting, type Three Ravens into the search bar, click to vote, and then confirm your vote via email.
We are, of course, a little baby podcast against the scale of some of the big cheese podcasts out there. I mean, Red Handed seem to just keep on winning, and they attract millions of downloads per month, but we got to try, haven't we?
We do. It would be very nice to even get onto the long list. So if you have an email account and 5 minutes, do please swing by britishpodcastawards.com/voting and vote for Three Ravens.
Right then, Martin, we're going to be talking about La Monvoisin, a person who I don't know very much about, although I did do some research on her quite a few years ago because I was considering writing a play about her.
Oh, sure.
But it's been quite a long time, so my memory of her is quite rusty. In terms of murders, do we have a sense of quite how many people she actually killed?
Well, it's estimated that she killed up to 2,500 people.
Whoa, that is so many people.
Yep, and conservative estimates peg her total number of murders at 1,000. That number isn't really disputed, meaning it could be much higher. And the number is much, much higher when you factor in her entire poisoning network, which was quite extensive.
I find the whole subject of poisoner networks to be very interesting because, well, thankfully we don't have them today, but there's quite a long run in European history where we know about these poisoner rings, many of which were based around wives seeking to kill their husbands.
Yeah, this is distinct from items of jewellery known as poison rings, as worn by the likes of Lucrezia Borgia. So rings with a little section inside, often hidden beneath a jewelled clasp, which contained poison for slipping into drinks or what have you. Those were very popular in the Middle Ages, including amongst royalty and generals seeking to avoid capture and torture.
Yeah, they're very interesting in their own right and continue to be popular as a feature of drug culture today. I mean, people can still hide illicit pills or powders on their person to take with them when they're on the go.
Yeah.
But I'm talking more about these networks, normally of women, like the one run by Giulia Tofana in Rome, which killed, was it like 600 husbands?
Yeah, over 600 men killed by Aqua Tofana, this mix of poisons made by Giulia Tofana and her network of around 40 women in Rome during the 1630s. Then there was the Spana prosecution, which involved about 30 women and happened again in Rome decades later. There's lots of recorded cases, including into more recent times with poisoners like Graham Young, the teacup poisoner, who only died in 1990. But most often, historically, mass poisoners and poison rings have traditionally been made up of women.
Which only makes sense in that more often than not, women were going to be the ones preparing food or bringing the drinks or maybe laying out or preparing clothes.
Exactly right. You wrote about the poisoner Mary Blandy in your story for this week's Oxfordshire episode. And although male poisoners did exist, prominent examples include the likes of William Palmer, the so-called Prince of Poisoners in the 19th century, who Charles Dickens was really interested in. Women were more commonly killers by poison across history.
And I think that's probably because, if we're honest, it's harder for women to kill men using what we might call traditional means.
Yeah.
You know, like strangulation or other forms of physical force.
Well, that's one of the curious things about the law, actually, particularly in England, where the sentence of first-degree murder was always more often applied to women in murder trials, largely because a charge of first-degree murder requires evidence to show the murder was planned.
And because women used objects like poisons or weapons, I'm guessing that meant it was easier to prove premeditation.
Yeah, whereas men were often much more able to argue that their crimes were second-degree or third-degree murders known as crimes of passion. Something as simple as a woman reaching for a fire iron when being attacked by a man and then bludgeoning that man was considered a premeditated crime, whereas strangulation, or a man simply punching a woman so hard it killed her, was more often argued a crime of passion and given a lesser sentence.
It's so unfair, isn't it? Because it's practically very difficult for littler people such as myself to physically overpower larger people like you.
Yeah.
I mean, this has been proved time and again when we've tried to have tickle fights.
Yes.
We need planning time and weapons and things. That's how I win a tickle fight.
Yeah, you're a bit like Batman. Preparation time is key. It's one of the many, many messed up things to do with our legal system and Europe's legal systems, to be honest. But in the case of Monvoisin and her crimes, she never actually killed her husband, even though it's widely known that she really wanted to. But boy, oh boy, did she help kill an awful lot of other people.
And just to clarify, which period of history are we talking about here?
So we're talking about the 17th century during the very long reign of Louis XIV.
Ah, Louis XIV, Le Roi du Soleil.
Yes, the Sun King, that's what they called him. And they call him that because he reigned for a whopping 72 years, the longest reign of any monarch in history. And during that period, lasting from 1643 to 1715, France experienced this boom in power, culture, science and art that made it a real hub of early Enlightenment culture.
Yeah, what I find amazing about Louis XIV is that he had this kind of unbelievable level of control over French life at the time, didn't he? He was a true absolute monarch.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was a pretty amazing guy when you read about the things he did, because he really and truly micromanaged almost every aspect of French life at the time. And part of why he was called the Sun King is he was seen as almost godlike, overseeing tons of reforms and wars, establishing peace and prosperity. His hands were on the levers of power, which were focused around the court at his very swish residence, the Palace of Versailles.
And during this period, France is a hugely important power broker in Europe, swinging the fates of several wars, including with the Dutch, the Spanish, the success of the Catholic Church in Rome. The 9 Years' War didn't go great for him, but otherwise he had a mighty successful run of it.
Yeah, he did. And yeah, he was also a bit of a cad and a bounder, because sure, he was married to Maria Theresa of Spain, with whom he had 6 children, but my goodness, did he have a lot of affairs.
Well, his royal mistresses were famously some of the most powerful women in France during their periods in favour, weren't they?
They were, the most powerful of which was François Athénée de Rochechouart, aka the Marquess de Montespan, whose rise in power was inextricably linked with, and possibly even the direct work of, Monvoisin.
Very interesting. And so to focus on Monvoisin then, from what you've said to me in advance of our episode recording, this lady, who became known as Monvoisin, not only murdered a whole bunch of people, but she's also thought to have done quite a lot of other pretty ghastly things as well.
Yeah, she did. I mean, this bit is deeply morally complex, but for example, Monvoisin also confessed to having terminated, with her chief abortionist, in excess of 10,000 pregnancies.
Whoa.
Yeah. And irrespective of your stand on abortions, in France at the time, terminating a pregnancy was considered a serious legal offence. Not quite on the level with murder, but not that far off it.
So hold on, she conducted 10,000 terminations.
So she said.
I mean, that is quite an unreal number. Surely that can't actually have been the case.
It does beg a belief, doesn't it? Because we know that Monvoisin died when she was in her early 40s, so quite young, really. And just doing some basic maths, if she started working as a midwife as a teenager, which is possible, but still, even if she did, and began administering terminations at that point, you're talking then about her engaging in, or perhaps overseeing, roughly 400 abortions a year, meaning more than one a day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to express some doubts about that number right away. And also, you say she confessed. When did all this happen?
Well, Monvoisin was executed in 1680, before which she confessed to some, but not all, of her crimes.
Okay, well, 1680, I mean, in English terms, we're into the Restoration, so Charles II on the throne. We're deep in that era of spying and naval warfare. The Anglo-Dutch Wars have been burbling away on and off for years.
Yes.
And witch trials were still very much happening at that time.
Oh, yeah, and Monvoisin, whose full name was Catherine Monvoisin, was actually tried as a witch and found guilty of witchcraft and burned at the stake.
That is pretty ghastly. But still, any confession she gave or is reported to have given immediately has to be considered suspect, because witch trials were not ever straight down the line.
Yeah, as discussed on previous episodes of Something Wicked, not least our episode about Alice Kittler, witch trials throughout Europe were more or less a total sham. But in the case of Monvoisin, we do have a range of other corroborating witnesses and some physical evidence, all of which means it's almost certain that Catherine was definitely up to some very bad things, if not all the bad things that people sometimes level at her.
Okay, well, take us back to the beginning then. Where was Catherine born?
So she was born Catherine de Chay in the late 1630s, early 1640s. We're not entirely sure because, as is so often the case with French history, the records of her birth were destroyed during the French Revolution. But we do know that she was at work on the streets of Paris before she turned 10, earning money as a fortune teller.
I mean, being a preteen fortune teller in 17th century France feels like a very risky business to me, let alone the fact she was a girl. Presumably, she had company. I mean, somebody must have been working with her.
Well, we know that her mother lived with her and continued to live with her after Catherine was married. So we can probably presume that she was the kind of public face of her mother's business. I'm only speculating here, and you'll be doing an episode all about cunning folk in our episode of Magic and Medicines for next week. But you can kind of imagine Catherine and her mother, whose name I couldn't find in my research, working on the streets of Paris, giving out cures and remedies and telling fortunes, and it seems their business was pretty darn successful.
And how do we know that?
Well, there are a few factors that speak to it, not least her list of clients, which involved a wide array of very successful people in French society. But also, in her early 20s, she married a jeweller and silk merchant called Antoine Monvoisin, whose premises were based at Pont-Marie in Paris. So that's the point at which she changes her name from Catherine de Chay to Catherine Monvoisin, which was shortened over time to Monvoisin.
Okay, so she's moving up in the world right from her 20s, an enterprising woman marrying a jeweller and a silk merchant, which is a potentially profitable business, but also quite a risky one.
Yeah, so Antoine Monvoisin, her husband, certainly had access to the upper echelons of society. He was a well-connected man. Yet, we also know that his business was significantly less profitable than his wife's, and that Antoine actually had to declare bankruptcy more than once, something which was compounded by his alcoholism and a penchant for gambling.
Well, it seems like Antoine was a bit of a wrong 'un then, drinking and dicing away his profits.
Yeah, indeed he was.
Yeah, he said that Catherine never poisoned him and did away with him. I mean, do we know why? Because I'm presuming having a liability as a husband wouldn't much help her in what seems like quite a flourishing business in the Paris of her day.
Well, as mentioned, Antoine Monvoisin was incredibly well connected, and one of his closest friends was the royal executioner, Charles Sanson. And Antoine had already told Sanson that if he were to die of anything other than old age, then Sanson and the French court should look into the affairs of his wife, who would then be the prime suspect and person most likely to benefit from his death.
Oh my goodness, so a bit of a toxic marriage then.
Yeah, it was a total mess. And we know that La Voisin, Catherine, had lots of quite high-profile affairs, including with a number of members of her broader network of magicians and occultists and courtiers and assassins. So, yes, she and Antoine remained legally married, but we might say that their affairs were their own.
I see. But presumably these marital and, to an extent, business issues weren't immediate problems. I mean, we often talk about honeymoon periods in new marriages, don't we? When everyone's getting along and striking out into married life with an air of optimism.
Yeah, so in the early days of their relationship, things did seem quite rosy. At this home and business premises on Pont Marie, we know that for a time, Catherine and Antoine lived together with Catherine's mother, and in quite swift order, 3 children, 2 boys whose names we don't know, and a daughter named Marguerite, who has a very important role to play in the La Voisin story.
How so?
Well, Marguerite ended up being a really key witness in what was known as the Affair of the Poisons, this huge scandal which rocked Paris and resulted in a series of quite dramatic witch trials. We'll get onto that in due course. But back in the 1660s, you have this seemingly quite functional family based at Pont Marie, where La Voisin quickly earns this enviable reputation as an incredibly effective fortune teller.
I find this very interesting because the fortune-telling business is a tricky old game. We know that there are strategies that fraudsters have used for hundreds of years to convince people they're having their fortunes told. But also, fortune-telling was a serious business during the Renaissance, in particular, involving birth charts and astrology and all sorts of arcane arts.
Yes.
And none of those were really seen as the kind of hocus-pocus flummery most people would consider them today. Like, astrology was thought of as a science.
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned a goodly number of occultists and alchemists across the course of our 3 Ravens episodes, including the likes of Dr. John Dee and Giordano Bruno, Nostradamus and Cornelius Agrippa. But it's important to remember people like Isaac Newton, Evangeline Adams, Arthur Markin, a lot of prominent people in public life gave a lot of credence to strategies like astrology and fortune telling right through into the 20th century.
And so was this the kind of business that La Voisin was running? Because there's fortune tellers and fortune tellers, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to be working on the streets reading palms for a few pieces of silver, and a whole other thing to be a courtier offering advice on matters of national importance.
Well, La Voisin started as the former, but very quickly became one of the latter. She started out specifically as a palm reader and also a face reader. So she would study a person's face and make predictions based on the lines and wrinkles and the shape of their heads.
Which kind of harks to phrenology, which we spoke about on our Burke and Hare episode.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolute bunkum phrenology with a very dark history all of its own. But as her business developed and she started to branch out, she was very much helped on her way by her husband's capacity to trade in precious and semi-precious stones, jewellery, and in silks.
So did she make amulets and charms and things?
She certainly did, for some very wealthy and connected people, and did so very stylishly attired. For example, she famously had an outfit known as her Empress robes, and these were made of red silk. It was a gown, basically, embroidered with 200 coloured golden eagles with matching slippers, and that was just one of the outfits she wore when meeting with her fancy clientele.
Whoa, I want some. And when you say fancy clientele, how fancy are we talking?
Well, we know that her clients included Olympia Mancini, Comtesse de Soissons, and Marie Anne Mancini, Duchess of Bouillon, both daughters of Baron Lorenzo Mancini, an Italian aristocrat, necromancer, and astrologer, whose brother, Cardinal Mazarin, was Louis XIV's chief advisor.
Cool.
Yeah, very cool. She also had clients including Elizabeth, Comtesse de Gramont, who was Queen Maria Theresa's lady-in-waiting, and Francois Henry de Montmorency, Duke de Luxembourg, who was the Grand Marshal of France, the general in charge of the French campaigns in the Franco-Dutch War and the War of the Grand Alliance.
Okay, well, these were pretty significant people then.
Yeah, they most certainly were. La Voisin was by no means the only fortune teller in Paris at the time, but she was known as one of the most prominent and successful, and was seen as the go-to person for members of the French court. And not just for fortunes and charms, she also sold a range of potions, balms, and medicines, including love potions and aphrodisiacs.
You mentioned love potions at the start of the episode, and you said something about a particular insect used in the making of love potions.
Yeah, so we actually have the recipe for La Voisin's love potion, which was designed to work as an aphrodisiac as well. So you'd slip it into somebody's food or drink without them knowing, and it was intended to make them fall in love with you.
Which, as discussed on many previous episodes of Three Ravens, is horrendous behaviour, as anyone who's had their drink spiked in the modern era will attest.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking this up, and it might seem like that kind of behaviour is a thing of the past, spiking food and drinks with quote-unquote love potion. But a recent YouGov survey in the UK discovered that 10% of women and 5% of men have had their food or drink spiked by a stranger.
It's so scary. I mean, in modern times, the drug used most commonly is Rohypnol, which is a date rape drug.
Yes.
I can't imagine that's quite what La Voisin was peddling.
No. If anything, La Voisin's love potion recipe was even less healthy.
Oh, God.
Specifically, it contained toad bones.
Absolute classic. Gotta have a bit of toad.
Mole's teeth, iron filings, human blood, the dust from a ground-up mummified corpse.
Another classic.
And ground Spanish fly.
I can't imagine that ingesting iron filings is going to be good for one's health. And nor is mummy dust, honestly, although it does pop up in a number of these remedies.
Yep.
But Spanish fly is an ingredient I feel like we should have talked about already, but I don't think we have.
No, I don't think we have either. And although it sounds like a fly, like a blue bottle fly or a horse fly or something, Spanish fly is actually a kind of rather striking emerald green beetle. And it was famed in alchemy from the Roman era on as an aphrodisiac.
But ingesting Spanish fly had some pretty unhealthy side effects, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, and it still does if you're unwise enough to ingest it. Because Spanish fly is poisonous. It can cause heart attacks, so it's actually quite dangerous to ingest, although it was used for this alchemical purpose because it was known to quicken the heart, make people sweat, and also to sort of make people engorge or swell up.
And we have records of people using Spanish fly as an aphrodisiac way back in the classical era, don't we?
Well, we do. For example, it was given to Roman gladiators before orgies and was widely used by kings and queens and emperors and empresses. The trouble is, the kind of engorging you get from Spanish fly is actually a full-body allergic reaction.
Yeah, and I think they used to use it sort of on particular spots, I'm sure you can imagine. But like, if you get mashed up bits of Spanish fly on your skin, on the outside of your body, it kind of causes a chemical burn. Sure, it makes parts of you swell up, but it also makes your skin blister.
Yes.
So imagine the damage that would do inside your body.
Well, it causes gastrointestinal bleeding. It can cause kidney failure, has a good chance of causing seizures and convulsions that can leave people comatose. But it does cause swelling of the genitals, including priapism, meaning erections that just won't go down.
And in that single solitary sense, it does function a little bit like a drug like Viagra, which can stimulate arousal in both men and women and sort of provide this kind of hot, swollen, itchy feeling. But unlike Viagra, it comes with a series of other rather painful and potentially deadly side effects.
Yeah, it sure does. So don't muck about with Spanish fly, dear listener.
It ain't worth it. Also, it's not vegan. Leave the Spanish flies alone.
No. Anyway, we know that Lavoisin sold love potions and other potions, as well as charms, and performed fortune-telling to the very tip-top upper echelons of French society, including for people in the court, such as Queen Maria Theresa herself.
Blimey. So from telling fortunes on the streets of Paris to servicing the literal Queen of France. Fair play to Lavoisin. She did a pretty amazing job as an entrepreneur and a businesswoman.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And what's even cooler, in my view, is while Antoine's business on Pont Marie went under and he declared himself bankrupt, Lavoisin was able to afford to move her premises into a new, rather grander location at Villeneuve-sur-Gravois.
Oh, wow. So her husband's business goes under, but hers expands.
It does.
They were not a team, were they?
They were not a team. And by this time, incidentally, they've had 3 more children. And it seems like Lavoisin's mother has passed away. And at this new building, which they move into in the 1660s, though it no longer exists, it's a much larger space. It has also 2 quite large separate buildings in its gardens, one of them being a crypt. And this crypt, this marble tomb, actually leads down via a connecting stone stairway into the Paris catacombs.
Hold on a cotton picking minute. Her new house connects to the Paris catacombs. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's sensationally cool.
Because the Paris catacombs today are this enormous ossuary containing something like 6 million bones. It's a wild place.
Yeah, well, in Lavoisin's day, they were mostly just abandoned mine shafts left behind after extensive limestone quarrying from the 5th century onwards. This limestone, it's worth saying, is what was used to create the famous material plaster of Paris. But from the 17th century, with so many of Paris's graveyards overflowing, the bones of the long dead were gradually being relocated into these mines, a process which massively increased during the 18th century.
So here she is, this incredibly upwardly mobile fortune teller, expanding her business into these new premises. I'm presuming this is going to be the point at which she also diversifies.
Yeah, it is indeed. Or at least it's the point at which her already probably quite diverse business expands in a big way, necessitating the employment of a range of new staff, much to the anger of her competitors.
Oh man, I'm so here for this. I'm excited. Catherine Monvoisin, a woman in her early 30s, making her way in the world. Deadbeat husband, but she doesn't care. She's opening new premises and she's ready to diversify.
Yeah, she sure is. And it's also worth saying, as I mentioned before, Lavoisin isn't the only woman doing this in Paris at the time. For example, she has a competitor, Marie Bosse, who was married to a horse trader who mysteriously died.
Ah, mysteriously.
Yeah, she was another fortune teller and cunning person operating at the time, going by the name La Bosse, compared to Catherine Monvoisin, who obviously worked under the name Lavoisin.
I'm loving this. I need my fortune told. I need a magic charm. Do I go to La Bosse or do I go to Lavoisin? It's like they're competing fashion houses or something.
Yeah, it is a bit. And Lavoisin is for sure the market leader. She has the biggest business in Paris when it comes to this stuff. But there are lots of ladies doing similar, including a woman called Marguerite Joly, who ran a much more exclusive kind of business, serving fewer clients but for vast sums of money. There's Magdalene de la Grange, whose specialism was in providing antidotes rather than poisons, although her antidotes were often poisons, so she was an absolute charlatan. Plus, there was a wider network of alchemists that worked with them too, but the important names for the purposes of our story are Lavoisin and La Bosse.
Okay, so we have these women, Lavoisin and La Bosse, plus others who are running these businesses, telling fortunes, selling magical items like love potions. But this bonus series is called Something Wicked, not Something Awesome. Because quite frankly, this sounds awesome and I want to watch a Netflix series about it. Let's hear how it all ended up getting so dark.
Well, I think it would be fair to say that the whole enterprise was actually pretty dark, especially once Lavoisin and her family moved to Villeneuve-sur-Gravois. Because although it was widely known that Lavoisin held these rather beautiful soirees where she invited the great great and the good to concerts in her garden, hearing violinists play with plenty of fancy hobnobbing. The garden pavilion out the back of Lavoison's house was also the centre for illegal abortions, with that wing of the organisation run by a woman called Catherine Lapère.
Now, obviously, this is a complex topic, but you mentioned earlier that Lavoisin said she'd been responsible for over 10,000 abortions. Was that working with this lady, Catherine Lapère?
It was. Lapère was a midwife like Lavoisin, and Lapère had actually helped Lavoisin deliver her 6 children. So basically, what Lavoisin did was employ Lapère within her garden pavilion, along with other members of staff, including a woman named Margot. And there, women would come both to have help giving birth and to have pregnancies terminated. And it was a very busy wing of Lavoisin's empire.
On the one hand, this seems like a good thing. Like, vast numbers of women have died in childbirth across history, and even today, a surprising number of mothers pass away during childbirth. Having babies was and is a dangerous business.
Yeah, absolutely. And that Lavoisin and Lapère were providing these services does seem to me like a very good thing. And they also helped women who wanted to terminate pregnancies. Now, I know that many people feel very uncomfortable with the idea of being able to access abortions. Personally, we are both firm believers in a woman's right to choose, but there definitely was a dark side to what Lavoisin and Lapère were up to.
I'm just going to double, if not triple, underline what Martin's just said there. We're living in a time when abortion rights are under attack in many quarters, and we are firmly on the side of women having control over their own bodies.
Yes.
That is not to say that Lavoisin's side business here is exactly the model we'd condone.
No, definitely not. Because Lavoisin was not the only person who offered these kinds of services in Paris at the time. I mentioned the rather exclusive services of Marguerite Joly earlier, and she similarly employed an abortionist who worked with her called Marie Buffet, and their business model was quite similar.
Well, which was?
Well, in the case of unwanted pregnancies caught reasonably early, fetuses were disposed of. Lavoisin, for example, had a furnace hidden behind a tapestry in her garden pavilion. But for those women who were too far along in their pregnancies, they would come to live and coalesce for a time with Lavoisin or Marguerite Joly until the pregnancy came to term. Then these women would deliver their babies, and Lavoisin and Marguerite Joly would take those unwanted babies off their hands free of charge.
Hold on. I feel like we've just taken quite a dramatic turn into a really shadowy place. So, is there a sense in which these women were running baby farms?
Well, unwanted babies were in great demand, and not because these women wanted to find them happy homes. In fact, we know that Lavoisin and Marguerite Joly also worked with a woman called La Pelletier, and La Pelletier was a baby trader.
That sounds absolutely dreadful.
Yep. So specifically, La Pelletier would buy unwanted babies from mothers throughout Paris, often poor women, often sex workers, and she would sell those babies to Lavoisin and Marguerite Joly for use in, drumroll, black masses.
Black masses?
Yep, full on, actual to goodness, very well attended, very well reported, black masses.
Oh, holy moly.
Oh, unholy moly, as a matter of fact. Still, we'll get into the details, including in relation to Lavoisin's first and second trials, what actually happened in these black masses, and Lavoisin's rather convoluted attempts to assassinate the king himself, right after this.
Okay, Martin, it's time. Spill the beans on these black masses.
Right. So remember how I mentioned that Lavoisin had this outbuilding with a set of stone stairs that led down into the Paris catacombs?
I do.
Well, that was where she held these black masses. And as with her abortionist business, she hired quite a few members of staff to work with her on these black masses, which were extremely expensive and only afforded by some of the very richest people in France.
This is kind of mind-blowing. And I'm guessing from what you're saying that the babies you mentioned before were used in these black masses.
Not just used, Eleanor, ritually sacrificed.
Oh, no, what?
This is incredibly dark and pretty fruity because the ceremonies involved a naked woman laid out across an altar in these underground catacombs with a golden chalice placed above her stomach. So, so far, that sounds reasonably fun.
Yeah, typical Saturday night. No problem. But
then a baby was held over the body of this naked woman, who was the person subject to this black mass, with the chalice being held in place by a defrocked priest, normally Abbé Etienne Juiberg, who was an actual renegade priest from Saint-Marcel Church in Saint-Denis. Then Monvoisin would stab the baby with a ceremonial knife with the baby's blood then draining out into that golden chalice and spilling onto the skin of the woman in question.
Oh no, I mean, that is absolutely horrendous.
It sure is. And we know, for example, that one of the nobles who engaged in just such a black mass was François Athénée de Rochechouart, better known as the Marquis de Montespan, the lady who afterwards became King Louis XIV's most favoured mistress.
So hold on, this woman, the Marquise de Montespan, went in for, presumably paid for Monvoisin to conduct one of these black masses, and was her goal to seduce the king?
Yep, it was her goal to use the power of Satan explicitly to make King Louis XIV fall in love with her. And whether the black mass was what sealed the deal, in 1666 she did supplant the Sun King's previous favourite mistress, Louise de la Vallière, and became, as the French court of the day called her, the true Queen of France.
This is kind of mind-blowing because my thoughts are going in two main directions here. I mean, one of them is down the horrific kind of avenue towards the reality of these black masses and child murders and thinking about the genuine horror of that, which is awful. And it's fascinating that they thought it would work, honestly. Yep. But on the other, it all seems almost unbelievable to me. Kind of like a story or a smear that would be made up at a later date to try and ruin the reputation of a former royal mistress.
Yeah, I have to admit, it does sound so outlandish that you wonder if it could possibly be true. But the amount of corroborating evidence is pretty overwhelming in that it really does seem like these black masses happened. And though the Marquise de Montespan became this true Queen of France figure, mother to 7 of Louis's children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood and who were legitimised, she remained a favourite in the court well after the affair of the poisons erupted into public life.
Wow. So, I mean, my brain is buzzing with questions. But presumably there were other people there, and not just Monvoisin, Etienne Juiberg, and the Marquise de Montespan.
Yeah, there were quite a few people involved. And we do have a contemporaneous account of this translated into English. Would you like to hear it?
Of course I would.
Okay, it reads: a long black velvet pall was spread over the altar, and upon this the royal mistress laid herself in a state of perfect nudity. 6 black candles were lit. The celebrant robed himself in a chasuble embroidered with esoteric characters wrought in silver. The gold pattern and chalice were placed upon the naked belly of the living altar. All was silent, save for the low, monotonous murmur of the blasphemous liturgy. An assistant crept forward, bearing an infant in her arms. The child was held over the altar, a sharp gash across the neck, a stifled cry, and warm drops fell into the chalice and streamed upon the white figure beneath. The infant corpse was then handed to Monvoisin.
Oh my goodness.
Yep. And the blasphemous liturgy mentioned there, we also have written down, which translated into English reads: Astaroth, Asmodeus, princes of friendship and love, I invoke you to accept this sacrifice, this child that I offered you for the things I ask of you. They are that the friendship and love of the king and the dauphin may be assured to me, and that I may be honoured by all the princes and princesses of the court, and that the king deny me nothing I ask, whether it be for my relatives or for any of my household.
Okay, so appealing to some pretty significant demons there. Astaroth and Asmodeus, both mentioned in last year's Three Ravens Bestiary episode about demons.
Yep.
And from the sounds of it, this ceremony was kind of designed to enable people to get whatever it was they wanted.
Yeah, it was actually designed to grant wishes. And it was said quite a few were conducted for a wide array of nobles.
Gosh.
And as for the other people who were present, we know quite a few of their names, including Anne Charon. She was a local fruit seller by day, but helped with officiation and with sourcing particular herbs, potion elements, and charms used for the rituals. Jacques Coton and Francois Mariotte, who were two other defrocked priests who shared duties with Etienne Juiberg. Gilles Davot, who was a Paris occultist famed for summoning demons and speaking to them through an obsidian mirror in the style of Dr. Dee, plus Adam Lesage, who was another sorcerer and occultist, who was also one of Lavoison's lovers. Oh, and a woman known as La Poignarde, who was tasked with organising and kind of booking the black masses in the first place.
So this woman, La Poignarde, was kind of on admin.
Yeah, black mass admin, along with Anne Charon.
This is absolutely wild. It's like a startup.
I know, it's crazy, isn't
And
it?
from what you're saying, this kind of thing didn't just happen once or twice.
No.
I mean, if we've got a bookings diary.
Yeah, we genuinely do. It happened fairly frequently. Like in the case of the Marquise de Montespan, she went back several times. Like we know that she had 3 of these black masses conducted in just 1672, at which time Louis XIV had begun a relationship with another mistress. So they weren't actually that unusual.
But I mean, if these things were happening with some degree of frequency, presumably people knew about them and maybe reported Lavoisin to the authorities.
Well, they did, and it's worth saying that Lavoisin was outwardly viewed as a fairly upstanding citizen. She went regularly to church at the Abbey de Saint-Amour and was widely liked and connected. For example, she was godmother to Francois de la Rochefoucauld IV, the man who later became the Grand Huntsman of France, so the courtier who organised all the royal hunts, having helped his parents, the previous Grand Huntsman and his wife, successfully conceive and give birth. But people did point fingers, and back in 1666, Lavoisin was actually hauled in front of an ecclesiastical court to answer questions.
Oh man, so I'm guessing some scandal swirled around that one, because if she's connected to all these important people and rumours are leaking out about dark and dangerous things, it is almost inevitable that local priests and lawyers are going to start to take an interest.
Yeah, they did. And so in 1666, she was hauled before a congregation of the mission at the order of Saint Vincent de Paul and was interrogated. And then she was put on a kind of trial at the Sorbonne University. And at this trial, she was asked all about her fortune-telling business in particular, but also her various involvements in things the priests at the time might have considered to be dark arts.
Well, based on how these things tend to go, I normally presume they would arrest her immediately and have her publicly executed. But you already mentioned that she was still at large in the 1670s, so I'm guessing this didn't actually go too badly for Lavoisin.
No. From surviving records, it appears that Lavoisin ran absolute rings around the academics and priests who interrogated her, with her defence ultimately coming down to the idea that her powers of perception, her fortune-telling, her various magical talents, they all came down to blessings she'd received from God.
Now, I have to say, this is a slight stroke of genius from Lavoisin, because on the one hand, you've got all these priests who claim to have their own kinds of magic powers, you know, transubstantiation, turning bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, being able to communicate with angels, all that sort of mystical priestly business.
Yeah.
And so, why not fight fire with fire? I mean, you guys say you're doing God's work with your priestly magic and your burning of incense and your incantations, while I, Lavoisin, upstanding businesswoman, am doing exactly the same sort of thing, just in my own way.
Yep. And of course, women couldn't become priests at this point in history. They could become nuns, but Lavoisin wasn't interested in becoming a nun. She had children and a business and all these very rich and powerful clients. And because she was able to demonstrate how she'd helped so many good and powerful people, and that she went to church and was kind of a member of the upstanding establishment in her own right, she came out the other side of this trial absolutely vindicated, seen as a woman doing God's work through mysterious magical means.
I mean, I know, based on all this evidence of child sacrifices, that she's evil.
Yeah.
She's a card-carrying member of Team Evil, isn't she? I can see that, and I don't want to downplay it. But I do also think it's fair to acknowledge and maybe even slightly celebrate her. I mean, she's kind of amazing, isn't she?
Yeah.
She's come from nothing, made a fortune, got herself connected right at the heart of one of the wealthiest and most powerful European courts. She's dodging trials, she's employing several members of staff, managing affairs with occultists, and, quite a busy Black Mass diary too. It is a pretty remarkable career trajectory.
It really is. And she probably would have got away with it too if it hadn't been for her meddling competitors.
Oh, wait, so hold on. I had kind of forgotten she ended up in another witch trial. So what's the story of La Voisin's unravelling then?
Okay, well, I've alluded to this a few times now. We're talking, of course, of the affair of the poisons, which was a huge scandal, which resulted in 218 people being arrested, 36 people either being executed or dying while they were being interrogated, 3 people being exiled, and it all kicked off because of La Voisin's main competitor, La Bosse.
I did wonder when La Bosse would re-emerge in the narrative. So what did La Bosse do that triggered all these pieces of legal action?
Well, early on in the episode, we were talking about poisoner rings, these groups of people, normally women, who sold poisons to help people do away with unwanted husbands or members of their extended family.
Oh, we did. And as far as I recall, the poison most commonly used for this purpose was arsenic.
That's right. An odourless, flavourless powder, arsenic was actually known by another name during the 17th century, or rather a nickname, which was inheritance powder.
Inheritance powder. Oh, that's kind of brilliant. Because, of course, with the careful administration of arsenic, you could secure your inheritance.
Yeah, that's right. And so, amongst the many poultices and tinctures and other services that La Voisin sold was inheritance powder. She sold a lot of the stuff, trading in arsenic with a wide range of people, including importers who would bring it in from other countries, and a very broad network of people, not just in Paris, but in France more broadly.
So she's kind of working on the principle of franchising here, like selling her product to the mass market.
She is. And again, she's hardly the only person in Paris at the time involved in this business. For example, Louis de Vannen was a famous alchemist in Paris. He ran demonstrations of how to turn base metals into gold. He sold love potions, potions which supposedly helped people find lost items. And he'd learned alchemy from another famous alchemist, Françoise Galop de Chastoy. And together they ran a business with a banker called Pierre Cadelin, who helped Vannen sell his various powders and potions outside France.
Okay, so La Voisin was part of a wider trend for this kind of thing in Paris at the time.
Yeah, she was. And in terms of her wholesaler, the person she bought the arsenic from, that was a man called Maître Pierre, who supplied some other poisoners and cunning folk, including Marguerite Delaporte, another fortune teller who was a famed hydromancer. She saw visions in magically prepared water. And it was Delaporte who introduced La Voisin to another of her lovers, the alchemist Denis Pocalot.
Crikey. So hold on. How many people did La Voisin have affairs with then?
Well, quite a few from what we know, including an executioner named André Guillaume, a man called Monsieur Latour, who was the Vicomte de Soussaron, the Count de Labatie, then there was the alchemist Blessy, the architect Fouchot, a magician, Adam Lesage, an alchemist, Denis Pocalot.
She did have a husband as well, didn't she?
Yeah, Antoine Monvoisin, who almost outlived his wife, by the way, dying of old age in 1679.
My goodness, she was a busy woman.
She was a busy woman. Anyway, you had all these poison sellers, people like Marguerite Delaporte, Mathurine Baronton, Francois Filastre, Marie Jolie with her upmarket business. She employed her own poison maker, by the way, Anne Méline. I mean, there were dozens of people involved in these businesses, murdering thousands of people. And it all started to go wrong in around 1676.
Because?
Well, because in 1676, Princess Henrietta of France, so Louis XIV's sister, enjoyed a lovely glass of iced chicory water. Delicious.
The latte of its day.
Yeah. Only then, she started experiencing abdominal pains.
Uh-oh.
Yep, and then she fell ill, and she was dead before midnight.
Okay, so suddenly these deaths from poison, which presumably have been happening fairly frequently throughout Paris and Europe more generally, but suddenly they're happening in close proximity to the throne.
Precisely that. And so, at this point, in 1676, things are in a bit of a pickle with La Voisin too, because one of her lovers, Denis Pouchelot, has been kidnapped.
What? Just kidnap boyfriend? How did that come about?
Well, Denis was known as someone who'd done these public displays of turning base metals into gold. So the Marquis de Termes, a minor nobleman, kidnapped him in an attempt to force Pouchelot to make him rich.
Oh no, Denis!
Yep, bad news. Anyway, so around the same time, the king once again entered into a new relationship with a woman called Angelique de Fontagne. And so the Marquis de Montespan called on La Voisin for help.
Presumably seeking another potion or a black mass or something similar.
Well, not on this occasion, actually, because we do know that over the years, the Marquess de Montespan had used love potions bought from La Voisin on Louis XIV, but on this occasion, she determined that no poison or black mass was going to cut it. The Marquess de Montespan wanted both the king and Angelique de Fontaine killed.
Whoa, so we're shifting now from a bit of magical jiggery-pokery into full-blown murder.
That's absolutely right. And the plan was pretty elaborate. For example, one of La Voisin's associates, a man named Romani, was a master of disguise. He was a kind of sneak thief come assassin and was actually engaged to La Voisin's daughter, Marguerite.
Blimey, a master of disguise. This story just gets better and better.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Anyway, so there's two elements to this plan. The first is that La Voisin laced a set of gloves with poison, and it was then Romani's job to don a disguise and somehow get the gloves to Angelique de Fontagne. They had initially thought to make a poisoned dress, but concluded that poisoned gloves would be more easily carried and possibly even just surreptitiously slipped into the king's mistress's pocket.
Whoa.
Then the other element of the plan involved another associate of La Voisin's, a woman called Catherine Trianon, who was another fortune teller who managed her business with her lesbian lover, La Daudet.
Oh man, now we've got lesbian assassins in on the story. This just gets better and better.
Well, Catherine Trianon and La Daudet, they famously had a human skeleton in the waiting room of their business, which is a pretty boss touch, in my opinion. Anyway, La Voisin commissioned them to make a petition on parchment using poisoned ink. And the plan was for La Voisin to take this petition, which asked for Denis Pouchelot to be released from the clutches of the Marquis de Termes, to the king. And so the petition might kill two birds with one stone. The king would read the petition, ingesting the poison from the ink through his skin, and simultaneously Pouchelot would end up freed.
Blimey, I mean, it's ambitious, and there are a lot of moving parts to this plan.
Yep.
But as discussed earlier, Louis XIV lived for quite a long time and didn't die from a poisonous assassination in the 1670s, so I'm presuming this all went wrong.
I mean, it didn't come to pass in the end, not because all the various elements hadn't been prepared. They all had. And it took them quite a long time to try and get it all sorted. They worked on the schemes for 3 years. And La Voisin did even take the poison petition to Louis XIV's court 3 times. Trouble was, there were so many people petitioning him on the days that she went, she never actually managed to deliver the petition.
That is wild. Just think, if the queue to see him had been a little bit shorter, yes, European history could have gone a whole other way.
It really could. Instead, though, La Bosse got drunk at a party while all this was happening and started shooting her mouth off. And the whole thing basically then collapsed like a house of cards.
Gosh darn it, La Bosse, ruining a good thing for everyone. And what did she actually say?
Well, at an evening soiree involving the great and the good, hosted by a woman called Marie Vigarot, who was also a fortune teller and a wet nurse to several aristocrats, La Bosse got a little bit tipsy and started spouting off about how rich she'd become due to her business selling inheritance powders, saying all I need is 2 more clients to buy my wares, and I'll have enough of a fortune to retire.
And I'm imagining at that moment, the party fell quiet and everyone turned and maybe someone dropped a cake fork and it made a terrible clatter and everyone realised the jig was up.
Yeah, because after the death of Princess Henrietta, Louis XIV had tasked the chief of the Paris police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, with investigating poisoners in Paris. And he'd already had one notable success, the case of Madame de Brinvilliers, who was this noblewoman who poisoned her husband, 2 brothers, her daughter, and her daughter's husband.
Wow, I mean, she wasn't even trying to be subtle.
No, she was beheaded and her body was burned. Apparently, 100,000 people came to Paris to watch her execution in 1676. Then, in 1677, he also arrested a woman called Magdalene de Lagrange, who, with her associate Louis de Vanin, were implicated in the mysterious death of a rich lawyer called Jean Fourier, who Delagrange had hastily married before murdering just 2 weeks later.
Oh, come on, Madeleine. If you're going to Black Widow someone, you need to space things out. Be happily married for a bit, let people believe your relationship is going swimmingly, and then do the murder.
Yeah, well, Magdalene de Lagrange and Louis de Vanin, they were arrested and kept in prison for years, not taken to trial because of a lack of evidence. Only once La Bosse made her admission at this party in front of the great and the good, including several lawyers, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, this chief of police, then arrested La Bosse and Marie Vigoureux, and things very quickly started to unravel.
I mean, to a certain extent, it does rather feel like it was time. From what you've said, it's been going on 20 years of selling potions and poisons and horrifying black masses.
Yes.
And at a certain point, things are going to come to a head.
Yeah, they are. And so Lavoisin, realising the jig might well be up, burned the poisoned parchment, which she'd been trying to assassinate the king with, expecting to be arrested. And of course, La Bosse, once she was in jail, was like, don't know why you're bothering with me. My business is nothing compared to Lavoisin's.
Oh, La Bosse, what a disappointing way to go. Absolutely no solidarity with the sisterhood there.
No, she was very much trying to save her own skin, giving up information about her associates to sort of try and lessen her own sentence. And by this time, incidentally, Romani, the master of disguise, had actually managed to get himself employed as a valet de chambre to Angélique de Fontanges.
Whoa, they got so close.
Yep, and there were 100,000 French crowns on the table if Lavoisin and her team had managed to pull the job off, which is the equivalent of over £4.6 million in today's money. Still, La Bosse and her big mouth saw that scheme soon collapse, and then the mud started flying thick and fast.
Well, such as? Because I'm not going to lie, this sounds like there's going to be some pretty juicy, scandalous accusations flying about.
Oh, there was. For example, immediately Vigoureux, the wet nurse who'd hosted the party, she immediately implicated La Bosse in the death of the husband of the noblewoman Marguerite de Pouillon. She was the first noblewoman arrested, and she confessed and was immediately banished from France.
What? So she poisoned her husband and she was only sentenced to banishment?
Well, she was from a noble family, no, but actually, she was confined for the rest of her days to a workhouse for former prostitutes in Angers, so it wasn't a light sentence.
Oh, fair play.
Yeah. Vigoureux also confessed to having provided the Marquis de Feuquier with a magic potion which made him immune to harm in battle, and to supplying him with a poison to kill his fiancée. He was a soldier and the son of a diplomat, but he got away scot-free, no charge, while Vigoureux actually ended up dying during interrogation when her bones were crushed.
Oh man, so the police were using medieval torture methods to try and extract confessions.
Yeah, they were in some instances, although the most common form of torture they used was called the water method, which was actually the same kind of torture used by the CIA in the wake of September 11th.
And I imagine the confessions gleaned from effectively waterboarding these people were about as useful as those extracted from the various Guantanamo inmates.
Yeah, pretty much. And if you want to know more about waterboarding and Guantanamo, do listen to the most recent series of Serial. It's super interesting.
Yeah, it's great.
But in the case of La Bosse, she was in a right pickle anyway and didn't actually require torturing because she was not required to confess.
How so?
Well, they had her banged to rights because, in addition to being a loudmouth at that party, before arresting her, the police conducted a sting operation where they had, in essence, an undercover officer go into her shop to buy inheritance powder, and she just sold it to them. So that was already pretty damning.
Yep, no admissions of guilt necessary there. I love that. It's like undercover very early on. It's great.
It's fantastic, isn't it? But to compound matters, when the police actually swooped in to arrest her, they found La Bosse in bed with her daughter Manon and her sons, Francois and Guillaume, involved in a pretty freaky intergenerational incestuous orgy.
Oh, come on, La Bosse. I know this is 17th century France, but incest is not okay.
Yeah, it's not okay. And her eldest son, Francois, was a soldier in the Royal Guard, so that was its own little scandal. But still, after they'd all been arrested en masse, literally in the middle of this incident, La Bosse just started naming names and implicating everyone she'd ever worked with.
What a disaster.
Yep. So La Voisin and over 200 people were arrested, with fingers being pointed this way and that. And La Voisin kept it pretty cool to start with. She was arrested having just attended Mass with her servant Margot, and the two went into questioning, with Margot breaking first, saying, in effect, if you continue with this line of questioning, this will mean the end of a number of people at all levels of society.
Big words, Margot, but probably the best move would have been just to keep stum.
Yeah, well, Louis XIV directly demanded the extermination of anyone associated with this poison ring. So La Voisin's associates were rounded up, including La Voisin's daughter Marguerite, the defrocked priests like Jouiberg and company, the alchemists like Lesage, the abortionist crew, including Le Père, plus Romani and the rest of La Voisin's network.
Oh man, this is a complete disaster.
Yeah, it sure is. But La Voisin, as this powerful figure, wasn't tortured. Instead, she was plied with booze. And by this time, La Voisin was known to have developed a drinking problem, much like her husband. And so, day after day, week after week, they just kept her drunk and kept her talking. Then, little by little, out seeped these boasts.
Such as?
Well, how many abortions had she committed? Over 10,000, she said. And who were her clients? Out came the list. And so it was revealed that, for example, a number of judges who died, leaving happy widows. They'd been clients of La Voisin. A number of parliamentarians who died. Again, their wives had been clients of La Voisin. And along the way, La Voisin explained the development of her career and her business, always being very careful to avoid any mention of the Marquess de Montespan, because, let's be honest, if the authorities found out about that whole incident, she'd then be implicated in attempted regicide.
She sure would. So am I right in thinking, based on what you've said, that La Voisin was never tortured into making a confession?
No. Unlike a lot of the other people who are implicated in the affair of the poisons, she kind of gave enough away through her drunken boasts, corroborated by what was learned from other witnesses, that she was ultimately convicted of witchcraft in February 1680.
And you mentioned earlier she was burned at the stake.
Yeah, in public at the Place de Grève in Paris on the 22nd of February 1680. She's said to have pushed away a priest who attempted to offer her the last rites, and to have not gone quietly, kicking away the haze stacked around her even once they'd lit it on fire.
So grim.
Yeah, but that's not the end of the story.
It isn't?
No, because, of course, though 34 people were executed, including the abortionist Catherine Lepere, Anne Charon, who had been on Black Mass admin, Marguerite Joly and her staff, who were waterboarded and then hanged, plus La Bosse and her staff and family members who were burned at the stake, the investigation hit a sticky wicket when it came to the interrogation of Marguerite Monvoisin, La Voisin's daughter.
Oh, yes, you did say she ended up becoming a key witness.
And so she did, because after the death of her mother, Marguerite decided that the best move to try and save her own skin was to reveal the details of all the affairs relating to the Marquess de Montespan, the king's mistress. all the details of the black masses, their love potions, the poisoned gloves and dresses and petitions, like the whole damn thing.
Oh my goodness. And Monvoisin, of course, hadn't admitted to any of that, even after those weeks and months of drunken interrogation.
Yep. And a number of Monvoisin's associates, not yet put to death, corroborated Marguerite's evidence. There was actually a whole other wave of arrests. And that included corroborations with things Le Boss had said before she died, such as the bones of all the sacrificed children the authorities would find in the garden of Monvoisin's premises, various nobles who'd attended or been part of these black masses, and then the likes of Adam Lesage and Romani, the various defrocked priests. All of them finally started to give up the goods, at which point a truly remarkable thing happened.
What?
Well, the king was informed. And once he started to learn the details of these crimes, not least those involving his mistress, who at the time was still in the French court, he had the investigation stopped, all the witness statements sealed, and the remaining prisoners moved to different prisons under a lettre de cachet.
So he hushed the whole thing up.
He sure did. And so 6 women were imprisoned at Château de Villefranche, 12 women at Belle-Île-en-Mer, 14 women at Saint-André-de-Salins, and 5 women at Fort-les-Bains. We know that all 38 of these women were never put on trial, never allowed to go free, and were guarded exclusively by other women to prevent them escaping through seduction and black magic.
Very wise, although I bet some of them would have seduced other lady guards without too much trouble.
Yeah, me too. Meanwhile, 18 of the remaining men were imprisoned at Château de Sauce, with 10 more locked up at Château de Besançon, with one really incredibly cool additional link, just to cap all this off. It is sometimes postulated that Eustache d'Auger de Cavois, one of the accused, was none other than the man in the iron mask.
I mean, could that be the case? Because the man in the iron mask isn't a made-up story. There really was this prisoner in France at the time whose name was unknown then and whose identity remains a mystery, who was kept in a silk hood or an iron mask to prevent anyone ever seeing his face.
Yep, we know that the man in the iron mask was kept anonymous because he knew information considered so politically scandalous that he was never to be spoken to or addressed, and he was moved around between prisons, including those I just mentioned. And nobody knows the exact fate of a number of the people in the Monvoisin story. Romani, for example, the master of disguise. We know he was imprisoned in 1782, but one day he was moved and vanished from the record. So who knows? A possible candidate.
And so what happened to Marguerite? Was she one of the women perpetually in prison?
She was on the island prison of Belle-Île-en-Mer. No idea of her date of death.
And the Marquise de Montespan, what happened to her?
Ah, well, she remained in the court right up until 1691.
What?
Yeah, the king just sort of didn't want to think about the black masses and her poisonings and attempted murder of both him and another one of his mistresses. So for the next 10 years, she remained at court. Until in 1691, she was encouraged to move to a convent with a vast fortune. And for the 16 years that followed that, she dedicated her life to penance and charity, giving away almost all of her wealth before dying at the age of 67 while out swimming.
So she got away with it then?
Yeah, not a worry there. And her children, via the king, all took up positions of political power and honour in the French court.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, thanks, Martin. I won't be forgetting about Monvoisin in a hurry.
No.
But what are we going to be talking about on next month's episode of Something Wicked?
Well, next month we're heading across the pond and talking about H.H. Holmes, the 19th century serial killer and fraudster who's believed to have lured as many as 200 people into his murder castle in Chicago, allegedly at the behest of Satan himself.
I feel like the word allegedly is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting in that sentence.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree.
Still, a murder castle sounds very interesting. And as always, dear listener, if you're enjoying the podcast and have 5 minutes, do please hop onto iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen and drop us some stars, give us a thumbs up, or write us a review. We'd very much appreciate it.
Yes, please. And also on Saturday, we very much hope you'll enjoy this week's Local Legends interview with Oxfordshire local and host of the History of England podcast, David Crowther.
Plus, also on on Saturday, we're hosting this month's Three Ravens Book Club live stream, where we'll be chatting with members of the Three Ravens community all about this month's Three Ravens Book Club pick, The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo.
Very exciting. After which, of course, we'll be back on Monday when I'm taking us back to Kent with a brand new story.
And as ever, if you're not already a member of our Patreon community and would like to support the podcast, receive all of our episodes ad-free and unlock a ton of exclusive content, please consider signing up to our Patreon for $3 a month or $6 a month at patreon.com/Three Ravens podcast.
Do also email us your thoughts, feedback, or your own interesting bits of local lore to threeravenspodcast@gmail.com, which is the same place to send your own original tales of terror for our Three Ravens Ghost Story competition.
Yes, original stories of 3,000 words maximum, please, and include at least one ghost. And we'll read the winners as part of our Three Ravens haunting season in October.
Otherwise, do please keep sharing the podcast, telling your friends, and gronking away on social media, whether on the Three Ravens podcast group on Facebook or on our page at facebook.com/Three Ravens podcast, on Instagram at Three Ravens podcast, or on Twitter via @Three Ravens Pod.
And please vote for us in the Listener's Choice category of the British Podcast Awards by visiting BritishPodcastAwards.com/voting.
Yes, please do, and ask your friends to vote, and your mum, and your pets, provided they have email addresses.
Many pets do.
Yeah, many pets do. Anyway, until next time, while our mass murdering witch goes up in ribbons of smoke that way, we'll go this way.
And remember, don't whistle till you're out of the woods. Our theme song is the traditional folk ballad Three Ravens, performed by Eleanor Conlon and Ben Harbour, and our logo is by Ollie James Dare.
The Three Ravens podcast is a Rust and Stardust production, written and produced by me, Martin Vaux. Thanks for listening.
God send every gentleman, such hounds, such hawks, such leman, with a down, derry,